become a structural story architect. I'm Ira Nayman. I know stuff. So I thought we would start with the basics. You probably all know this, but the fundamentals of structuring narratives were known at least 2,500 years ago. They were laid out by Aristotle in the Poetics. He wrote things that are still very useful, I think, to us today, and a fairly good place to start a discussion of narrative structure. Aristotle said that you must start a story at the point where anything before it would be irrelevant. And once you have begun your story, everything should follow from logic and necessity. Logic and necessity. So that means that when you have one scene, the next scene must follow in a logical manner from the scene that came before it, and be a logical predecessor to the scene that comes after it. And, you know, in a very basic sort of way, we can understand that. The antagonist does something, the protagonist does something to respond to that, then the antagonist then has to do something to respond to what the protagonist just did. And so you end up with a chain of events that happens in a sequence that makes sense, right? And finally, of course, your story should end, after which anything else that might come after would be extraneous. And we generally think of endings as, you know, as the denouement. So when the final battle between the antagonist and the protagonist has happened, there really isn't anything left to say. Ordinarily, we would have perhaps a small coda where we would show the aftermath of the battle, the aftermath of the interaction between antagonist and protagonist. But generally speaking, you want to keep that as minimal as possible, because the story really ends when the conflict ends. That's pretty basic stuff. Now, I find it very useful to consider what Brenda Laurel wrote about Aristotle about 30 years ago now. Her approach to telling stories in a way that builds on Aristotle. Brenda Laurel was a very interesting person. She was actually a theater professor who wrote one of the seminal books on interactive narrative and interactive storytelling. And her approach was, I find, very fruitful. Imagine that you are sitting in front of your computer, or if you're like me and you write in longhand, imagine that you are looking at a blank page. When you're looking at the blank page, it is possible to write virtually anything. You have virtually an unlimited supply of potential stories. And as you make choices, you limit what the story can be. Okay, so I mean, a couple of trivial examples that, you know, we all start with. If you decide that your main character is going to be a woman, then your main character can't be a man, right? It's just, it makes sense. You've made that choice not possible. If you've set your story in Toronto, your story obviously is not set in Montreal or Calgary or any other city. Those are, you know, basic examples. But then when you start getting into the plot, so when your antagonist does action A, that means that that antagonist has not done action B, C, E, or even D. When your protagonist then has to respond to the antagonist's actions, the protagonist's actions are limited to what makes sense rationally as a response to what the first person did. And the story develops. She called it a flying wedge. Imagine, you know, a V shape where at the beginning you have a whole universe of possibilities. Then as an author, as you're making choices and the characters are making choices, the possibilities get thinner and thinner until eventually you come to the end of the story. And the end of the story should have been inevitable from the accumulation of all of the details that came before it, all of the interactions that came before it, everything that you had said about the characters and the world. And this is really important because when we write a story, any medium, any story, when we get to the end of the story, we want two things to happen. On the one hand, we want the story ending to be a surprise. We don't want the reader or the viewer to anticipate what is about to happen. On the other hand, and this goes back to Aristotle, we want that ending to be inevitable, to make sense, for the reader or the viewer to go, of course, it couldn't have ended any other way. And that's a difficult balancing act, as most of you probably have experienced in your own writing, how to make that work. The easiest way of illustrating how an ending should properly function is to think of mystery stories. And it just so happens that before I was a science fiction geek, I was a mystery geek. I actually grew up reading mystery novels, so I have a bit of a background in that. And the thing about mystery novels is that usually they end with a big reveal, and the detective gets all of the suspects in a single room and goes through the detective's reasoning about how they came to find the murderer, right? And the detective usually will refer back to facts that have been sprinkled throughout the book or throughout the movie. So that by the time the murderer's identity is in fact revealed, it should be obvious that the clues were there in the story all along, and it had to be that person. But again, in a well-written novel, it isn't quite so obvious, so that the reader hasn't guessed before the detective has his chance, usually his, more often her in modern detective fiction, to reveal it for themselves. So that's a couple of different ways of approaching sort of traditional storytelling. But, and this is in the panel description, as filmmaker Jean-Luc Goddard said, a film has to have a beginning, a middle, and an ending, but not necessarily in that order. So what I'd like to address here is stories that don't start, stories that aren't strictly speaking linear, stories that don't start from A and just go through the alphabet to Z, but stories that start at A and then jump to F and then go back to C, and that in that kind of manner. And to give you some sense of why I'm interested in this kind of thing in particular, I should point out that in my other life as an academic, I have a master's in new media studies, or media studies actually, and a PhD in communications. And particularly my master's thesis was on interactive storytelling, interactive narrative. And I was particularly focused on how artists can use interactive media in new ways to tell new kinds of stories. And so I've thought a lot about narrative structures and how we think of how we make sense of the information that's contained in a story, whether or not the story is strictly speaking linear, right? And this is an important sort of thing to think about when you're thinking about interactive narratives. When you are writing a traditional narrative, when you're writing a novel, even when you're writing a traditional screenplay, you have complete control over the course of events. You know exactly what information the reader or viewer will experience, and how they will experience the order of things in such a way that you can have complete control over the effects of the ordering of your scenes. With interactive narratives, that's a lot trickier. The whole point is to give the reader or the viewer choices. And because you give the viewer or reader choices, you give up some of the control that you have over what path they experience the story in. You give up some control, not by any stretch of the imagination complete control, because as many theorists of interactive storytelling have pointed out, um, you still have control over how each section is linked to all of the other sections, right? So there is still some control over some aspects of the order of the events in your narrative, but by no means complete. And particularly when you're talking about interactive novels, like interactive stories that have 40, 50, 60 or more thousand words, the more linkages you do between scenes, the more paths you create through the narrative, which means ultimately the less control you have over the reader's overall experience of the story. And so that means that you have to allow for a certain amount of serendipity. You have to allow for a certain amount of lack of control on your part to what you're actually to the experience you're actually creating for the reader. Now, how do we experience stories? How do we experience scenes? I find that a useful way of thinking about this progression of scenes, I mean, I find a useful way of thinking about this is to go back to early experiments in film techniques by Russian filmmakers. There is a very famous experiment by a Russian filmmaker named Lev Kuleshov, who was trying to illustrate the principle that not only do we, when we're watching a film, not only do we experience and get meaning out of individual shots, but we tend to read between the shots and infer certain things that may not have existed in the individual shots themselves. So, for instance, in his original experiment, he had an actor who he suggested would be as devoid of emotion as possible. Just a shot of an actor's face, not emoting at all. And he paired that shot with, and I want to get this correct, he paired that shot with a shot of a bowl of soup, a girl in a coffin, and a woman reclining on a lounger. And what he found when he showed those three different shots to an audience was that the audience actually inferred emotions. They projected emotions onto the face depending upon what they assumed the face was looking at. So when the shot was the soup and then the face, they assumed that the man was actually looking hungry. When the shot was the person in a coffin, the little girl in a coffin, the face was sad. They projected sadness. When it was a woman on a lounger, the audience projected passion, desire, things like emotions like that. And so this is actually a very useful thing, just as writers, for us to remember that even with traditional narratives, when you have scenes strung together, the reader will bring their own experience, bring their own ideas of what the story can and should be to what you have written. And so they will interpret it, hopefully, if you've written it well enough, in ways that you had intended. But it's also seriously possible that they will bring new meanings to what you've put down on the page. Um, and there are ways of dealing with that, depending upon how comfortable you are with the sort of semiotic idea that it's the reader that actually creates the text in the process of reading rather than the writer. The obvious sort of way of dealing with this is to make sure that your prose is as concrete as possible. Personally, I think I like a story where I have to do some interpretation. I think a lot of readers do, and I think that that actually is more involving for a reader. If you lay out everything in a very concrete way, then the prose, kind of almost goes through the reader. You get to the end of that kind of a story, and you're like, okay, yeah, that happened. That was interesting. But there's really not much for you to take away from that story. Whereas if there's a certain amount of ambiguity, if you make the reader actually work to develop the meaning in the story, then they have things to think about after the story is over, and it will tend to stay with them a lot longer. But in any case, other Russian other early Russian filmmakers expanded upon Kuleshov's experiment. There is one other experiment that is worth noting, and it was an experiment that again used a blank face, but this time the face was intercut with a shot of a gun going off, a gun being shot. And there were two versions of this particular one. In one version, the gun was shot before you saw the face, and in the second version, the gun was shot after you saw the face. And in the first version, it was assumed that the person whose face it was the person who was getting shot. And then the emotions projected onto the person's face were anger and pain and surprise in some cases. In the second version, when the gunshot came after the face, it was assumed that it was the person whose face it was who was taking the shot, shooting somebody else. And a whole different set of emotions came into play in that case. Again, the order in which we experience scenes determines how we interpret them. And the same information in two different orders or multiple orders can give the reader a very different sense of what is happening. So it's important to understand those kinds of principles when you're dealing with story structures and how to structure scenes in ways that will have the creative impact that you intend to give. Now, having said that, even with so-called linear stories, we do often use techniques that that chop up the timeline, as it were, that don't tell the story in a straight linear fashion. These are often known as flashbacks, or in some cases, flash forwards. And of course, they are most often used to convey information at a point where that information is most needed. I'll give you a theoretical example just to clarify what I'm trying to say here. You have a character who is acting in a way that may not make that much sense to the reader. That character is reacting to stimuli, reacting to what's going on in the environment around them in a way that makes no sense. And your impulse might be to front load the story with the backstory of that character to explain why they're behaving that way. But of course, stories that that don't quickly get to the conflict, that start with backstory, that start with world building. Those are often stories that people, if they don't get to something, if they don't get to some kind of conflict fairly quickly, will stop reading, right? You have to start with something that will pull the reader in. And most of the time, or oftentimes, that will be your main conflict, or at least the inciting incident. Thank you very much. That will get the story started. So what you need to do, of course, is decide at what point does the tease, why is this character acting in this non-intuitive way, at what point does the tease become too much for the reader? And that's the point where you want to flash back to why the character became the character they did and is acting the way they are, right? But this is a flashback. This technically takes people out of the forward momentum of the story, but it does so in a way that I think we can all agree will benefit the story overall. So it's something that we can use to great effect. One of the most, in terms of flash forwards, one of the most common uses of a flash forward narration, or flash forwards generally, is to have a narrator, to have the narrator be a character in the story who is telling the story from a distant point of view, right? So it's like, when I was a young man, this is what happened to me. I remember it like it was only yesterday, sort of thing. Which technically what that does is it makes the entire story a flashback. But what it also allows you to do as an author is that periodically you will have that narrator come back in and comment upon what is happening in the story itself, which sometimes allows the author to directly comment on the story that the author is telling. But also it can be another device for adding information at the right time, right? So the character can say, oh, and I remember the reason I did this was because when I was a lad, I did that or had that happen or whatever. Again, it's about finding the optimum place in the story to give the reader information that will then benefit their understanding of what is happening in the narrative. Okay, if that's all clear as mud, I'd like to give one example, and this is actually a cinematic example, but I think it's a very useful one. It's a film, it's the Christopher Nolan film Memento, which was much commented on the time because it had a very odd narrative structure. Memento, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a film about a man who has a rare disease that means that he cannot create short-term memories. So he's always forgetting whatever happened a couple of minutes ago. And so what the Christopher Nolan did was he tells that story of the man, and the man is, he's tattooed his body with clues about what happened in the past. And so he knows that he is looking for the man who murdered his wife. What Christopher Nolan has done is he's told this story essentially backwards. So it starts off with the main character in the film present, looking for his dead wife's killer, and then it goes back in time to show how he got to that point. But the film is actually a little bit more complex than that, because that's only one of two storylines that's running through the film. The other storyline actually starts in the past, and it's a much more linear storyline. And it's about how it's still after his wife's death, but it's about how he started down the path we see him at the beginning of the movie. And the movie has a really interesting structure. So on the one hand, you've got a series of scenes moving backwards in time, but you also have a series of scenes moving forward in time. And at the end of the film, of course, those two timelines meet. Now, this is, and a lot of people at the time thought that this was a very gimmicky sort of way of telling this story. But I would argue that, in fact, there were two very good reasons for telling the story in this way. And I'm going to move to sheet 2 to get to that. Move to page 2. The first one, and I admit I'm a huge fan, and I thought this was brilliant. The first reason for telling the story backwards was that it essentially puts the audience in the same position as the main character, in that we do not know what came immediately before the scene we just saw. We're exactly in the same sort of headspace that the main character is in. And to me, that's a very compelling reason for doing that. But it also allows Nolan to give us a revelation that we probably would not have gotten if we had seen the film in a linear fashion, right? This is a spoiler, sorry, but the film has been out for many, many years now. When we get to the final scenes, one of the things we find out is that the main character at that point in the film knew who his wife's killer was. And he chose to wait a couple of minutes to forget that information so that he could keep on his quest to find the killer. And this is kind of it's a really interesting revelation in the context of the film, because as the film had been progressing, we had seen him being used and abused by a lot of people who thought it was fun or had serious motivations to manipulate his lack of short-term memory. And there was a lot of sympathy built up for the character because of this. But that final revelation, at least in my case, it made me completely reconsider how I felt about that character and his quest. Because he was not just a victim, he was an active participant in the decision-making that led to what happened in the rest of the movie. The impact of that scene, though, would not have been so strong if Nolan hadn't structured the film the way that he did. And that, I think, is perhaps, the most important takeaway from thinking about nonlinear structuring and how we want to tell our stories. If you're going to do something in a nonlinear fashion, if you're going to jump around, you have to be very much aware of the effect it's going to have on the reader and how the reader appreciates and understands the story you're trying to tell. And there are always good ways of doing that and good reasons for doing that. I do not trust storytellers who seem to jump around for no apparent reason other than they can and it's cool, um, but have no real sense of the effect that non-linearity is having on their readers. Okay. Whew, I've talked for half an hour. That seems like more than enough of me. I am quite happy to take questions now. If anybody has a question, please throw it into the chat area, and I will be happy to address any aspects of storytelling. It can deal with anything I've seen, anything I've said so far. Feel free, if you choose, to ask about anything that I haven't addressed, and hopefully, if I oh, Brenda Laurel. Brenda, Laurel, and if you give me a second. Sorry, I should have had this information for you before. Okay, so the okay, I'm putting this information into the chat area. Computers as theater, and she was talking specifically about computer programming, but she was using her theater background, and I found it just an amazing resource for telling interactive narratives. So if you're interested in that, okay. How does Aristotle's structure compare with non-Western structures? Well, of course, we've had 2,500 years of storytelling to call upon at this point in time. I would say that that for most people, most of the time, Aristotle's ideas are still fairly valid, right? But yes, then you have experimental films, you have Dadaist films, you have surrealist films, you have all sorts of other storytelling stories being told, I guess, that Aristotle's ideas do not apply. But now, again, the thing is that you can't just throw Aristotle out and hope that something works. To use just one example, so the surrealists, they were trying to capture in their films and stories the quality of dreams and nightmares. So that gave them organizing principles for the kinds of stories they wanted to tell, right? So my suggestion would be we can certainly envision other forms of storytelling, but they have to have their own internal logic to replace the Aristotelian logic. What are the practical considerations to keep in mind when using an unreliable narrator? That's an excellent question. My suggestion would be that you have to seed your story with clues that, with descriptions and actions that go against what the unreliable narrator is saying. I'll give you an example because I just think it's a great book, and I think it gets a lot of unfair criticism from people who've never read it. Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. is told from the point of view of a pedophile. Basically, it's told from the point of view of Humbert Humbert, the man who is in love with uh, sorry, the man who is in love with a 14-year-old girl, and who eventually kidnaps her from her mother and takes her on an adventure which we are led to believe, led to understand, is sexual in nature. Humbert Humbert believes with all of his heart that it is a romantic journey, and he believes, and he is constantly saying, that Lolita is a willing participant in the venture, right? But there are elements of the narrative that come through, even through Humbert Humbert's narration, because the story is entirely told from his point of view, which suggest that, in fact, Lolita is extremely unhappy about being taken away from her mother, and about what Humbert Humbert is asking her to do. Eventually, to the point where, behind his back, she phones up somebody to come and rescue her from him. And he puts the finest face on these things that he can, and seeing them from his point of view might color them a little bit for the reader, but it's Nabokov's way of saying very clearly that Lolita knows that Lolita is a victim, that despite all of Humbert Humbert's protestations to the contrary, she is not a willing participant in the story that he has created in his own mind. So these are the sorts of ways that you can cue the reader that the reader should not be relying entirely on the narrator, because the narrator is not reliable. Okay. Okay, Tammy asks, endings for series when the books are linked together. Any words of wisdom on how to handle? Well, part of this certainly is going to be a Panzer plotter kind of debate, right? I am very much a plotter. So when I start a novel, I know the beginning, the middle, the ending, and all of the main plot points in between before I actually sit down to write. I couldn't write a novel any other way. I couldn't. I couldn't sit down, as friends of mine do, with a character and an inciting incident, with a couple of characters and an inciting incident, and we throw the characters into it and just see what happens. That to me would be anarchy. Oh no! So if you're writing a series of books where there is a main plot line through the books, like the Stories of Fire and Ice, the George R.R. Martin series, then it really behooves you to know where your ending is going as early in the series as possible, right? Because again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about an ending being both a surprise but also inevitable, right? Which means that you're going to have to seed the ending throughout the books so that when it does come, the reader will be able to go, yeah, of course, it couldn't have ended any other way. If you don't have those clues, if you don't seed the books with that information, the ending might be a complete surprise, but the reader might also go, where did that come from? Why did that happen? So that's to me, that's very important. Now, on the other hand, my novels are in a series. I have 6 novels out, and they were not meant to be linked. Every book was meant to stand alone. They do build, so the characters do kind of grow over the series of novels as we get to know them, and they're in a shared world. So the world building continues throughout the novels as I get more ideas of what I can do with the world and expand upon it. But that doesn't require a fixed endpoint because they stand alone. There's no through line to end. Each book ends with its own ending, right? So I hope that that was helpful for you. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Darcy. Yes, okay. So Salem Wolf writes, I don't have a real question, but I'd like to hear more about the contemporary structure of the middle of a story. And yeah, that is where so many writers get stuck, right? We know where it begins, we know where it ends, but that middle is often a killer. In screenwriting, most screenplays are rejected because the second act didn't work, right? They didn't know how to get from the beginning to the end. There are some, sort of very basic ideas that you can apply to this. The obvious one, and it happens, you see it a lot, is to be constantly raising the stakes, right? So, I mean, you start with a conflict, and I think a mistake that a lot of writers make is they just let the conflict play out. Um, and that can work if it's complex enough, but it doesn't usually. What usually happens, what you need to sort of do, is constantly be raising the stakes. So when the antagonist responds to an early action by the protagonist, then um, that will put a third character in danger. You know, kind of the obvious way of raising the stakes. Or the protagonist may enter the story because they're being paid to do so, and the protagonist then takes it to them, and now it becomes personal, right? So you always want to raise the stakes, and in raising the stakes, of course, you're raising the tension. The conflict becomes more immediate and more visceral for the reader, right? And so if you're constantly doing that, by the time they get to the end, they should be, as we say in Yiddish, they should be sitting on spilkas. They should be eager to know, they must know how this is going to resolve. They must know how this is going to end. And so that is, I think, a common way of doing it. Some people will say that once you've set that conflict and you've got all the primary and secondary characters in motion, that should be it. Frankly, I'm big on subplots, and I'm big on sub-characters, and I have no problem myself introducing new elements as the story progresses. So some people will tell you you should not add new story elements, add new characters in your second act. That should all be established in the first act. I am not so doctrinaire about that. I'm quite happy adding those elements. And again, those can spur the story to go in new directions and for the reader to renew their interest because now they've got something new to consider, right? Something new to think about, and how the secondary plots, the secondary characters feed into the primary plots. Now, the common wisdom is that if you have a secondary storyline, if you have a subplot, that it should in some way reflect the main plot, usually thematically, although sometimes that can it can be a direct parallel to the story. Again, all good ideas, but not 100% necessary. I'm sorry, I seem to have 5 minutes left. And I'm going to try and get to as many of your questions as I can. Okay. Heart of Darkness was a great book, and I actually read Heart of Darkness after I saw Apocalypse Now and was just astonished at how many lines Coppola had taken directly from Conrad. It was amazing. Yes, absolutely worth finishing. Russian Ark, Arrival. Oh, yeah. Yes. Darcy suggests if you if you want more examples of nonlinear storytelling, just about everything Christopher Nolan does, like Inception, would be in that. Shutter Island, Russian Ark, Ted Chiang's Arrival, all have interesting storylines. Pulp Fiction, I was going to get to Tarantino at some point, but decided not to use that example. The Usual Suspects. Yep. Okay. Lost on television. Excellent. How should one handle, oh, good question. Richard S., how should one handle stories with multiple points of view? So what you want to do is to create a chain of information, so that, and a chain that the reader can make sense of at some point. I'm currently in the middle of reading a story with multiple points of view, and what that person does is they have basically a linear storyline, but each point of view, as when they move from one point of view to another, they take up the story from where the last point of view left off, right? That's a totally legitimate way of doing it, and it keeps it nice and simple, and the reader can follow that very, very easily. Now, I'm a big fan of Rashomon storytelling, and so for me, a lot of the fun of multiple points of view is when you have characters who, of course, disagree, right? And this goes back to not exactly unreliable narrators, but just the sense that everybody interprets events through the lens of their own consciousness, right? So everybody in the story is seeing the story in a slightly different way. So for me, multiple tellings of the same events by different characters have a greater impact. I find those very, very interesting. Now, just in my own writing, I will tell you. So I've been working the multiverse for my novels, and before that, for collections of short stories. I've been writing about multiple universes for about 15 years, for almost as long as I've been writing humorous science fiction. And one of the things that I've just started now doing are what I call triptychs. They're short stories, longish short stories or novellas, novelettes, that tell the same story set in 3 different universes. And sometimes it's the same character or a similar character, not exactly the same character, but a similar character in 3 different universes. Sometimes it's the same event, but told in 3 different ways. I've written 2 of them. I've got 2 more on the boards. I've got a lot more ideas to kind of work through. One of the great things about the multiverse is that it really helps me to explore the concept of how contingency works in our everyday lives, how the choices we make, and frankly, the choices other people around us make, affect the paths of our lives. And so when you can tell the same story from 3 different times, with the character making 3 different choices, and of course having 3 different outcomes, you're really commenting on how the decisions we make and the decisions other people make affect the directions of our lives. I am sorry, we are out of time. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful to you. And just a reminder, if you haven't got enough of me, in 2 hours, or no, sorry, in 1 hour, I will be hosting the Injecting Humor into Science Fiction panel. I hope some of you will attend that. I am totally accessible through my website, through the Amazing Stories website. I'm on email, I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I'm easy to find, so if any of you have any questions or would like to connect, feel free. Thank you, everybody.